Hello, my name is Briar. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be digging deep into the process that I took to get back into the novel that I had shelved for over a year in preparation for revising it and rewriting it, and it's going to be my Camp NaNo project. This story is a contemporary fantasy middle grade novel that I first started working on in NaNoWriMo of 2019, and I last worked on it before end of May this year. The last time I worked on it was about October of 2021 when I was revising it in preparation of writing the sequel for NaNoWriMo that year, which never got completed because I realized I had a lot of work to do. So yeah, but I shelved this work and I hadn't gone back to it. So it's been over a year and a half since I last worked on this story at the time that I came back into it. And I am excited to tell you about how I managed to get back into it enough to feel really comfortable back in this world. Getting back into a story that I've shelved, this isn't the first time that I've done that. I have had very long gaps between working on projects in the past, but my past experience has told me that I needed to be very intentional so that I could give this work the attention and care that it needs and I need in order to make it better for the new draft that I want to write. Do you have any experiences or tips about getting back into a novel that you had previously shelved? Let me know in the comments down below, because this is my first time doing so with so much intention, and it is definitely a better process. So if you have any processes, I would love to hear what you have to do and if it's similar to mine. When I first conceived of my story about kids going to a science camp and discovering magic in the woods and all the things that fall out from that, that was really the entire premise that I had. I only had the premise. I didn't have characters. I didn't have a plot. I didn't have any idea for the climax. I had basically nothing except science camp magic vibes. And so I pantsed my entire first draft of this story, and I wrote the entire thing complete at about 48,000 words in the month of November in 2019. Then I sort of shelved it and didn't touch it again until 2021, when I decided that I wanted to get back into this world and polish the first draft and write my sequel and really get back into the world of the story that I'd always envisioned as being a series. And so I polished it in 2021, but I didn't do a full rewrite. And when I left it, I thought that it was pretty good. I have since learned differently. It was not pretty good. It was pretty rough. It's still pretty rough. But I thought it was pretty good when I shelved it. So coming into this reread, I thought I was coming into a story that was, kind of complete. I was wrong. But since it had been so long since I even touched this story, even thought about this story outside of the vibes, I knew that I needed to do a complete reread in order to relearn my characters, the setting, the plot that I'd already developed. I needed to reread everything because I'd forgotten a lot of it. I was back to just knowing the vibes like I did when I first wrote that in 2019. But just sitting down to reread the story with a notebook and maybe taking some notes, I knew was not going to cut it for me. I have the working memory of a goldfish. I will forget what happened on page 2 by the time I'm on page 5. So I knew that I needed to be very intentional and meticulous in my rereading process if I wanted to really be able to see the overarching plot and the character development and the character arcs and see more of the bigger picture. I needed to give myself the tools to do that. So I created a document on Microsoft Word that I would use to track everything. And I'm going to show you what that is in a minute. Quick caveat before we cut to my computer screen. I say that I was rereading this, but to be honest, I've been having some issues with focusing completely on what I'm reading, and I knew that to reread and therefore improve this story, I needed to focus completely on what I was reading, but I've been struggling with that a lot. So my first draft, second draft, whatever draft that I was rereading, I found in Microsoft Word document form. And I took that to use the tools in Microsoft Word to have it read aloud the story to me instead of me having to focus entirely on reading, because reading with my eyes, I don't focus very well. But if I'm reading with my ears and listening to someone read this to me while I'm making notes on scratch paper, doodling, doing cross stitch, playing games on my phone, doing something that's not requiring a whole lot of thought, is very useful to me. So I reread this whole thing with the audio read aloud function on Microsoft Word, and that was super helpful to me in making sure that I was actually catching everything that was going on versus accidentally skimming over paragraphs, missing character development, missing important things that were just like a single line that I'd thrown in there. So I was really able to catch everything by listening to it and being intentional about the notes that I was taking. So let me show you the form that I used to make notes about this story as I was reading. So when I wrote draft 2 of this story, I had it separated out into 23 chapters. And I decided that I was going to do my reread going through each of these 23 chapters and making notes as I read along. I created this format to track the notes that I was keeping, to keep them in different categories to make it easier to compile and reference later. So when I was first starting a chapter, I would start with the data that I wanted to collect. I started with the word count, which ran anywhere from 495 words to 4,732 words or so. I had some chapters that were super short and some that were quite long. From there, I would start my reading. I would make note of the characters who were included in a chapter. I had my 5 main characters, well, my 5 central ensemble characters that I referred to them as the core 5. So if they were all in the same chapter, I would just list them as such. And then I would list any other side characters who were interacting with them, like the mentor character or the camp director or the camp nurse. And I would list out all the characters who were in that chapter in this document. If it was the first time that a character was introduced, like the first chapter where the nurse is included, then I would introduce that character in this line instead so that I could keep track of when characters were first named in the story. Although sometimes I didn't actually name the character, so the characters list or the characters introduced would be the girl mooning after Camp Counselor A or whatever. So I would have all of this filled out for the characters by the time I finished reading. I also initially was including questions introduced and answered in each chapter, like questions that were driving the story forward, like what's wrong with X, who's doing this, where is this coming from? But I ended up realizing pretty early on in my reread process that I was going to need to be doing a whole lot of rewrites, and the questions weren't as clear as they should have been. So I honestly didn't include much of this in the later chapters that I was rereading. But questions introduced were things like, does the camp director know about magic? Or questions that were answered would be like about their powers, like can Zoe teleport with more people? And then the answer would be yes, she can. Spoilers. Another thing that I tried to keep track of in this little data portion is the timeline in the story. So my story has a timeline that is very firm. It starts on Monday morning, it ends on Friday afternoon, because that is the length of the camp that the characters are going to. So I try to keep track of if I'm giving a time in the story, like if I'm giving, like they're meeting at 7 a.m. for breakfast or they're going on a hike at 2 p.m., then I want to keep track of that so that I'm making sure things are happening in a realistic time frame, and also that I'm keeping track of the days of the week so that I'm not having everything in the whole thing happens on Wednesday and then Thursday is completely ignored, but they still have stuff to do. So I'm trying to make sure that it's spaced out correctly. So I'll include things like this is happening on Tuesday mid-morning or something. And then if I included the time, maybe it says like 10 a.m. to about 12 p.m. And I'll include the timeline of the story. While I'm reading, the other thing that I am doing is I'm making note of possible improvements. What are things that I could change to make this story stronger? So examples of possible improvements that I would include would be things like, because I've already mentioned the camp director and my characters, and the big question here is, does the camp director know about magic? Like, I want the camp director to be more involved in the story. And then maybe he knows about magic. Maybe he wants to help the characters learn, and he's on one side of the two-sided battle. Something like that. So I would just include some possible improvements, things that I want to see in the story. As soon as I finish reading the full chapter, I will make a full paragraph summary where I'm trying to hit all the major events that happened in that chapter and summarizing it in, well, less words than it took to actually read the whole thing. So if it's a 4,000 word chapter, then I'm going to probably have a chunky paragraph summarizing all the things that happened. If it's a 400 word chapter, I'm probably going to have a very minimal paragraph summarizing what happened. But I try to hit all of the main story points in the entire chapter. So all the characters who are introduced, any of the emotional backstory. The paragraph summary is really a comprehensive summary of each chapter. I try to keep it to a paragraph, but sometimes for those chunkier chapters, a lot happened and I would end up making it like 2 paragraphs, and that's fine. But the main thing is that after I wrote the paragraph summary, I would go in and try to distill the entire chapter into the one main event, 1 or 2 main things that are important about this chapter, and summarize the entire thing with 1 sentence. And I tried to make this one small sentence. I didn't want it to be overly grandiose or wordy. I wanted it to be a punchy sentence summarizing everything that happened, all the important things. And so sometimes my sentences were a little bit more vague, whereas the paragraph is very detailed. The sentence is just, they found XYZ. And then also that spurred them to do all the other things. So the one sentence is going to be the most important thing that I'm using a lot in my revision. Once I have all of these things filled out, I have the paragraph, I have the sentence, I have all of my data and possible improvements, then I would mark the paragraph, the chapter title with an asterisk and minimize it so that I only have the chapter titles and they're all done. So that was my reread document. I hope that some of the tools that I use might be useful to you if you are rereading something as well, or if you're trying to get back into your story, or just making notes for a future revision. And that whole process of rereading that story, which was about 76,000 words, took me just over 2 weeks. I think I might have done the math wrong, but I think it was about 15 days. So it's literally just over 2 weeks. And that was a great time for me because I am not the fastest reader when I'm trying to be intentional about it. But once I had all that information, once I had 16 pages, 6,000 words of notes, what did I do with it then? So first of all, I needed to get that big picture plot because, like I said, I have the memory of a goldfish. 15 days after starting, I barely remembered what happened in chapter 1. So I took my 1-sentence summaries that I'd made and I listed them all out, and I have that just on a single document, and that's like my crappy synopsis. It is everything that happened in the story, but only the most important parts. And I might go back in as I'm continuing planning my revision and add in more of the details from the summaries that I wrote, the paragraph summaries, just to make sure that I have the full picture of that draft as I'm figuring out what I'm going to keep and what I'm going to discard for improvements in my next draft. And what rereading those sentence summaries all in order of chapters 1 through 23, I reread it all, and what that told me is that I immediately could see that I have some pacing problems and I have some character consistency problems. So those are going to be the main focuses of my rewrite, is making sure that my characters are consistent and fixing the pacing, because I had a lot of things like chunked together where it was like this chapter they're learning about things, and this chapter they're playing with their magic, and this chapter they're learning more things, and this chapter they're playing with their, and it just sort of like chunked around, and then there would just be sort of lulls in the action. So I need to improve the pacing to make sure that they're moving their own story forward rather than the characters being carried along by the flow of the story. I also took all of my possible improvement notes and compiled all of those so that I can see my thoughts as I was reading, and some things occurred multiple times. Like I mentioned that I wanted the camp director to be a more integral part of the story. I realized that he wasn't there as much as I thought he was, but I loved him as a character. So I wanted to make sure that he was built in more firmly into the story, and thought of a couple ways to do that. So I picked my favorite and we're moving on with it. I also noticed things like the magical history of my world, which is really informing my characters' motivations and their journey in the major conflict wasn't super well defined. So I needed to take some time to develop the backstory of the magic system and develop the societies that use magic in this world and how they're impacted by time and change and all those things. So I definitely needed to spend a lot more time with that. In the time since I have compiled all these notes and made all these things, I have been brainstorming on paper, because paper is where I do my best work. It's where I do my best creation of things and ideas and stories. So I've got scrap paper full of ideas for a plot. I've got notebook full of plans for how the characters' magic can be better utilized and how their interpersonal relationships can be better developed, and more about each character's backstory and the societies of magic and all those things. So I have so many notes of what could happen at this point that now I'm going back into my crappy synopsis and figuring out how what is already in place can be used to accent and support what I'm going to be writing in July. So this is going to be my Camp NaNoWriMo July project. Starting on July 1st, I'm going to open a brand new Word document and start from word 1. And it's going to be an adventure because I've never rewritten something entirely before, but I know that there's so much that I can put into this story and that I'm ready to put into this story, and I'm excited to get to it. This was also a process that I was kind of afraid of because I knew that I would need a lot of focus, and like I said, focus is an issue for me, but I have been able to do a lot more in a lot less time than I thought. Like, I've only been working on this for a month, and I already have so much to improve for draft 3, so I'm really excited to get started on July 1st. I hope you're as excited as I am about your July Camp NaNo project if you're participating, or if not, about whatever project that you're currently working on. Let me know what your project is in the comments. I would love to hear about other people. Have you ever had to reread a story to get back into it? Have you ever gone back to something that you thought you'd shelved? And what was your process like? Was it anything like mine? Let me know, and I'm excited to continue working on this project. Thank you so much for watching. I hope if you've enjoyed this video, then you'll like, subscribe, and be willing to go on the rest of my journey with me as I continue working on whatever it is that's catching my interest, because I have the focus of a goldfish. And as I'm trying to figure out how to direct my interest to focus on what I need to get done. I look forward to continuing to make videos, and I hope you will continue to support me. Thank you so much for every one of you who's watching, and I hope to see you guys in my next one. Pixel. Pixel, that's not an actual bookshelf. I know I decorated it to look like an actual bookshelf, but it's a box. It's a sideways box with a scarf on it. Pixel. Pixel, I think you shouldn't be there. But I guess there you are.